Hi, this is Amos here in the Moog Music Sound Lab, and I'm here to introduce the long-awaited and very nifty 1.0.4 update for the firmware of the Moog 1 polyphonic synthesizer. So I'm here with a Moog 1. It has version 1.0.4 on it, and I'm here to talk through all of the new features and improvements that we've made, demonstrate some of the new sounds and new functionality that we have, and answer your questions. So I'll just dive in and catch you up to speed on what's new, and we'll talk through it. And thanks very much for your time. So what we started with was, this is I think the first update of 2019. It's been in process for a while, and we have a long list of intended features and improvements and things that we're working on, and we're working our way through the list and trying to put them into sort of reasonable packages of stuff. As we get it completed, we're able to ship that out in updates. So as we're going through many of the things that we've talked about in the past, we've addressed some of those now, and I'm very happy to report that. And additional things that we continue to be working on will be rolled out in subsequent updates, some of which is in process right now. So in terms of what's new, some of the marquee features are there are new effects added to the effects section, the synth effects and the master effects. And that points out something that we've been saying since the beginning, that in this system we will be able to continually expand the sonic palette and the tools that are available for you to use as you're designing sounds. So this is one of the first instances of that. We now have a true stereo chorus and true stereo flanger effect. Now, there were previously chorus and flanger effects in the Moog 1, but they used essentially a single delay line, so that the actual the stereo image of your sound wasn't preserved 100% as it went through those effects. And that's the key difference with the stereo flanger and the stereo chorus, is that you have two independent left and right delay lines creating those time modulation effects. And that means that you're panning for individual sounds, any kind of, if you've got different timbres on the left versus the right channel, you're doing some big stereo spread sound, you can now incorporate chorus and flange into the sounds and keep this very wide stereo image. You can even get a wider stereo image now by playing with the left and right delay times. So those effects are available both as synth effects and master effects. And so if you go over to the effects section, I'm going to put it on as a synth effect here, go to the effects type menu, and you'll see that on the effects type menu now is a new stereo flanger and stereo chorus. And each one of those ships with a number of presets that Moog artists have designed to kind of give you some examples of how the sound basically is going to work. And I think probably the best thing to do is to start with an init preset, simple sawtooth oscillator, and that way we can hear any changes to the sound are coming from the effect. So this feed should be in stereo, so you should be able to hear some of these stereo sounds. I'm going to jump over and start with the stereo flanger, and I'll just load the basic preset. And as I turn on the effect, you can now hear that rich swirling going on. We can change the time of the left and right channels independently. I'm now adjusting the right channel. And now the left channel. And of course you can turn down the modulation. This is a fixed flange. And so you can use that as just a timbral shaping device, like a fixed filter, creating a nice comb filter effect. And if you want motion and animation, you can turn up the modulation depth. And right now that modulation depth is synchronized to the master clock. So what I was doing there is changing the rate of modulation. The time is continuously variable from 0.1 milliseconds up to about 15 milliseconds on the flanger. That's sort of within the flange time range. And then the modulation, the the LFO that's sweeping that time back and forth, it can be synced or unsynced. If it's unsynced, it can go from a very, very slow 0.01 hertz up to 20 hertz. And if it's synchronized, then you get your usual range of clock divisions from about 4 bars to 30-second notes. And you can set your times, your modulation times differently for the left and right channels, which again gives you this really big sort of stereo motion as the different delay times are moving independently of each other. And so a full range of, you also have tone controls, you've got gain, and you've got control over the feedback, and the feedback can be positive or negative, which is broadly similar to the flangers that were in there previously. So if we switch over to the stereo chorus, it's very similar, and chorus and flange being fundamentally very similar sort of time modulation effects. The main difference is the range of times. Flange uses a very short delay to give a nice peaky kind of comb filter effect. Chorus uses slightly longer delays. It's a little more washed and floating kind of sound. So here is the stereo chorus. There it is off. There it is on. And that's an example of extremely deep modulation. If we turn the modulation depth down, it gets a little bit less wiggly. And of course, that's probably going to sound more lush if we were to add some reverb to it, something like that. We can do that. But just to keep things simple, since we've all heard the reverbs, that's sort of a usage example. I'll go back to just demonstrating the stereo chorus. Again, you have independent control over the left and right times. And if I turn up the depth, you'll start to hear some more motion there. What I did just then was I adjusted the tone control. So the tone control controls how bright or dark the delay effect is. Typically, if you wanted like a vintage BBD sound, you'd roll it off a little bit, get a duller sound. And if you wanted it to be brighter and have more harmonics, you turn the tone up and turn the feedback up. And so there you have two very versatile and powerful new additions to the sonic palette of the effects engine. And again, those can be used individually per part on each of your synth layers, or you can apply them as a master effect. And remember that the master effects can be dual mono in terms of the sends going into them, or stereo. So you have a lot of options in terms of how you're controlling your stereo field and how you're stacking and layering your effects. And these two new options just give you more to work with. So very excited about that. That'll be an enhancement to any presets that you want to have lush stereo chorus and flange. So moving on through the new features, I'm just going to consult my notes here, so pardon me if I look randomly down and to the right. We have actually changed the intonation of the sawtooth oscillators, and we're able to do this via a firmware update because in spite of the fact that the VCOs are voltage controlled and analog oscillators, we are doing a lot of very sophisticated wave shaping by steering those analog control voltages in real time as the oscillator is running. So for every half cycle of the waveform, we are in the analog domain steering control voltages to shape the analog waveform that you hear. And we were able to go deep into the firmware, look at exactly how we were doing that wave shaping, and figure out how to get faster saw reset times, and which gives you an increased harmonic content. You get crispier, higher harmonics from the sawtooth. And so I can demonstrate that actually by going back to the init preset. And so we're listening to oscillator 1, and oscillator 1 has a sawtooth reset time of 60 microseconds by default. And that's the default that, that we shipped with originally. And it sounds like this. Make sure the filter's all the way open. It is. And so if we adjust the wave angle, we can now go from what the former minimum of 60 microseconds, we can go down to 6 microseconds. So I'll put it back at 60 and then sweep it while I'm playing some notes here. And so you get a much crispier, more cutting sound. All of those extra harmonics are going into the filter, giving the filter more to work with. And so you can just get more out of your subtractive synthesis because you're putting more in to start with. So very, very happy with that. And that's, again, this will not affect the sound of your existing presets. We made sure that these changes, everything is backwards compatible. Every sound that you saved is going to sound the same when you load it up, but you have that extra little bit of range that you can squeeze out. You can then adjust your presets. Any new sounds that you make, or if you want to tweak your existing sounds to have brighter, more harmonic content on the saws, that's available to you now. And all you need to do is turn the wave angle knob to minimum, and minimum is an order of magnitude faster than it was previously. So good stuff, more sonic improvements. We're very happy with that. Moving on down the list of new stuff, we have also added some functionality to the sequencer. And this is directly a response to user feedback. We are always interested in finding out from our users how they're using our equipment, what inspires them, and especially if something inspires them to go in a certain direction and they want to take it a little bit further than our initial design allowed, that kind of feedback is golden, because we can then say, oh, all right, you want to go in that direction, but even further, we'll help you do that. So, constructive feedback that feeds into improvements in our designs is, at the core of how we like to interact with our users. It makes our work better, and it helps your work to be more fulfilling and satisfying. So to that end, we got a bunch of feedback on the sequencer, and one of the main things that people said that they wanted to do to make their workflow easier is the ability to write a short sequence and then basically loop duplicate, copy paste it, make a sequence that's twice as long using a repetition of what you've already entered, or 3 or 4 times as long. And then you can go in and edit and make small changes, but you don't have to painstakingly re-enter the same small sequence again. So there's now a very simple duplicate function right within the Sequencer More page. So if I create a short sequence, then I see here I have an 8-step sequence. And if I go to the Sequence More page, I can choose those 8 steps and duplicate. I can say duplicate 1 through 8. And if I press this button to the top left of the LCD, then I now have a 16-step sequence, which is my 8-step sequence copied without me having to replay it. And so I can go change, say, just one note of that sequence very easily. And it should, there it is. I'll just rewind and play, and you should be able to hear it. And if I want, I can go back and further duplicate that again. And if I duplicate steps 1 through 16, I now have a 32-step sequence. Much, much easier than re-entering those 8 or 16 steps. And from the step edit page, you can easily go in and change just the steps that you want out of that sequence. And you have, it's just a quicker way to work. And this is a great way to introduce the next feature that we've added to the sequencer. I'm not totally happy with the 30-second note in that sequence. I might want to change it. And I might want to be able to punch in a new note without erasing what I'd already done, or without worrying about recording over other notes other than the one that I want to adjust. And so if we go back to the Sequencer More page, there's an option here on the last line called Recording Mode. And previously we had Replace and Overdub modes. Replace simply overwrites whatever was in the sequencer previously with your new sequence. Overdub layers new recorded notes on top of what was there previously. There's a new mode called Focused Recording Mode. And the idea behind Focused Recording Mode is that you can focus on a specific step and say, this is the step that I want to record over, and I don't want to disturb anything else or record any other stuff than that one note that I have selected. And so Focused Recording Mode allows you to do that. If you go to the Step Edit page, using the main encoder allows you to select a specific step. And so I can play the sequence, and I have this one step selected. And only that one note will be affected. So there we go. I like that. I'm happy with it. I'll turn off record mode. And you know, the important thing is you can punch in whenever you want, wherever you want, and only the step that you know you want to overwrite is going to be affected. And so that was direct, you know, user feedback, people saying, hey, I want to work in this specific way. And we said, great, we will help you to do that. And we'll continue to do that, and I welcome and encourage more folks to give us that kind of feedback. I love what this does, but I want it to do this one more thing. It'll make my workflow perfect. That's golden information for us because we want to help make it happen. So continuing on the list of what we've added in 1.0.4, the next thing on my list here is it's worth mentioning that the tuning of the instrument is something that we have been sort of constantly iterating on. It, as some people know well, and as others are, you know, are learning, it is a real endeavor. You know, you're working with physics essentially to try to get, you know, 48, 64, an enormous collection of analog oscillators that are affected by temperature and are affected by other physical factors. To get them all to play perfectly in tune all the time is challenging, but it's a challenge that we're up for and that we continue to make strides to improve. So the intonation of this instrument in the latest update is by and large much tighter across the board, and we're very happy with the degree to which we've improved it, and we're also still actively looking at sort of additional iterations, additional you know, degrees of improvement. So you should find the tuning to be much better intonated, much more consistent now, and to the extent that you find anything different, we are at this very moment continuing to test additional improvements that will be coming out as soon as they're ready. So that's an ongoing and constant process. We're getting some questions coming in from YouTube land, which is awesome. Let me take a look at them and see. All right, first question is the Sawtweak microprocessor controlled or full analog domain? Well, as I was explaining, the oscillator itself exists in the analog domain. Everything about it, you know, everything about the sawtooth generation is voltage controlled. Now, what is controlling those voltages is a microprocessor. So it's really not either or, it's both and. It is a fully analog VCO that at audio rate we're wiggling voltages around to get the performance that we want. So the tweak happened on the microprocessor, and in essence what it is controlling how we're steering the voltages of the VCO while it's playing. So what you're hearing is an analog VCO that's resetting faster. The reason why it's doing that is because of changes that we made to the microprocessor algorithm that is voltage controlling the VCO. So it's both. It is a tightly coupled mixed system where what you hear is completely analog and its behavior is able to be controlled in real time by a microcontroller. Next question is, someone out there has noticed that some of their patches are now brighter. Has any gain staging in the filter changed? Actually, there have been some gain stage changes, not in the filter section to my knowledge. I don't want to spread misinformation. To the best of my knowledge, though, the gain staging up to the filter is the same. The big gain staging change in 1.0.4 has to do with the master effects, which some people had noticed before that especially if you crank up the gain on the master effects, you could hear some noise floor there that was specific to the master effects. You turned them off, it went away, you turned them on, you got this little extra noise floor. And by carefully adjusting the gain staging into the master effects, and we were able to substantially eliminate that. And specifically what we did is we turned up the input to the effects and turned down the gain on the output of the effects so that we're sending it a hotter signal and we're not amplifying the output, including any self noise, as much. And additionally, there is actually a noise gate on the effect sends that we've added so that if there's no sound going to them, again, you're not hearing this amplified output of something that you're not putting any input into. So, these are all the sorts of things that in a studio situation, you'd look at your gain staging between your rack effect and your send on your mixer and your return on the mixer. And, part of good recording practice is to get all of those levels lined up to where you're amplifying what you want and you're not amplifying what you don't want. And we've applied the same philosophy to the master effect sends, and we're able to clean up that sound significantly. As to whether that would make the overall sound brighter, I guess that would be contextual. It might depend on your patches, and that's something that if you're very curious, by all means, you can send us the patches, and I or one of my colleagues can check them out and give you a more focused opinion based on those specific sounds. Another question from the audience: is it possible to hear or monitor modulation sequencing during the first pass? This is actually, there's been some back and forth about this because the release notes for 1.04, I wrote those, so I actually perpetrated a misunderstanding in those release notes about this exact question related to what happens when you've got a sequence that has some modulation lanes and you make adjustments to them. So I was under the impression that a specific thing had been fixed, and I wrote that up, and it turns out that what I wrote was not correct for 1.0.4. But additionally, in talking through it further, there's a little bit of maybe lack of clarity about when you should or when you should not hear changes that you've made to the modulation. So I'll try to explain that. Here's the thing that I thought was fixed. It is not yet, but it absolutely will be real soon, because as soon as I brought it up, it was clear to everybody that, yes, this is absolutely an improvement that we need to make. So specifically what I'm talking about is, let's say you have a sequence and it is stopped, it's not playing, and you want to adjust let's say the filter cutoff on a particular step. So I can set that up here. If I go to the modulations page and I choose step mod and I adjust the filter cutoff, now I'm not hearing anything changing right now, and I should be, because I have the step selected that I'm editing, the sequencer is stopped, the playhead is on this certain step, and so logically it would make sense that if modulations on that step should be audible. And what will actually happen is you won't hear that until the next time the step plays. So that is what I was alleging had changed. It hasn't yet, but by golly, we are going to implement that as soon as possible. Now, to avoid, just to clear up some additional points of confusion, let's imagine that I play the sequencer and I hit stop, and now it happens that step 30, the playhead is on step 30. Now, if I'm adjusting some sequencer cutoff on step 25, but the playhead is on step 30, it would be wrong if those tweaks that I was making to a step that's not playing were changing the sound that you're hearing in real time. And again, if the sequence is playing and you're making adjustments to a step that's not the one that's currently playing, it would be wrong if every tweak that you made to every step changed the sound, even though those modulations are only supposed to happen on the step that they play on. So I believe personally that it's the correct behavior that if you're playing a sequence and you're making tweaks to a step that isn't playing, you shouldn't hear the result of that until the step plays, because that's my mental model of how per step modulation ought to work. But it is definitely the case that if you are trying to dial in how you want a particular step to sound, the sequence isn't playing, and the step that you're adjusting is what's selected, yes, you should be able to hear that while you're doing it, and we will implement that real soon. And apologies for suggesting that that had been fixed for the first folks that downloaded the update and read the release notes. I believe that by now already, or if not, by the end of the day today, as soon as we can get that file edited with correct information about sequence modulation, we'll update the notes, we'll update the download, and anyone who downloads it in the near future and onwards will not have that point of confusion. So sorry to belabor that point, but that's the story, that's the solution to that mystery. And it is the case now, there was actually a change made, an improvement made, which is, it relates to when you load a saved sequence from the saved sequence menu. Those modulation values are now applied when you load the sequence, which previously was not the case. Okay, so there's more stuff that we've done. One of the biggest things that I'm excited about, this was sort of, the tuning improvements were a huge part of the work that went into this update. Another huge part of the work that went into this update was a major improvement to the MIDI functionality, specifically MIDI clock sync. You can now correctly sync everything on the Moog 1 to your master clock if you're using a DAW, a sequencer on your computer, a standalone hardware sequencer. Anything outside the Moog 1 that's a source of master MIDI clock, you can now sync to, and the sequencer and arpeggiator will respond to MIDI start and stop from your master clock. It'll follow tempo correctly and without drifting, stays in sync. And so this is a huge help for people that are using this in the context of a larger studio, a larger production where they have a lot of stuff synchronized to a master tempo. The Moog 1 now plays very nicely in that environment. One thing that I should probably mention that's come up in conversation as it relates to MIDI start and stop, if the sequencer on the Moog 1 is not on and you've never hit play, then just hitting MIDI start on your master clock, your DAW, isn't going to cause the sequencer on every preset to start playing automatically, because that would be weird and dumb and we don't want to do that. But if you press play on the sequencer to let it know, yes, I really do want the sequence to play, at that point, as long as that play button is lit, then the sequencer will start when you do a MIDI start, it'll stop when you do a MIDI stop, and it'll follow along with your master clock tempo. So just a user note for people that are wanting to dive in and start using this, you do have to tell the sequencer that you want it to play, and then it'll respond to MIDI start stop thereafter. And it also responds to song position pointer, which is subtle but extremely helpful for the situation where you're wanting to work on a breakdown, let's say that's at bar 64, or even some really odd numbered bar of your track. You can start, as long as your DAW sends out song position pointer to tell it, hey, I'm starting on bar 3, beat 5, then the sequencer and the arpeggiator in the Moog 1 will also start at the correct bar and beat so that it stays in sync with your project. And that's hugely useful, keeps you in your workflow. It means you can just set your playhead in your project, hit play, and the Moog 1 is going to play from the beat that you want it to start at. So that is a major improvement in 1.0.4 that I am already enjoying, and I'm sure other folks will enjoy too. And we've got some more questions. Will it ever be possible to use release velocity as a modulation source? Yes, there is technically no reason we can't do that. The keyboard does generate attack and release velocities. I'm going to make a note right now in my development notes to make sure that that gets in there, and we will do it. Timing of that update TBD, but it's on the list. I'll make sure it happens. Thank you very much for asking. Yay, feedback. All right, got some more questions. My assistant is writing furiously. We have a very high-tech system here that involves a dry erase marker and a whiteboard. And so while we're catching up on that, I'll go down my list and see if there's anything else I haven't mentioned. I mentioned the gate staging for the master effects. Yes, another big update that Windows users will probably have noticed in this update, or if you're a Windows user, keep an eye out for this in the download. There is a USB MIDI driver for Windows now for the Moog 1, and this allows the USB MIDI to show up in all of your software. It shows up with the correct name, shows up with the correct MIDI port names. And so if you've had any USB MIDI issues on Windows prior to this, the new firmware and the new USB driver should resolve all of those issues for you. We've had really good results from all the beta testers that have checked that out. So USB MIDI for Windows is now a happening thing. Oh, pardon me, that was completely unintentional and random. All right, more questions. Next question, can one sequencer be patched trigger transpose on sequencer 2 to essentially create a complex pattern beyond 64 steps? That is a really cool idea, and I think that the answer is no, not at this time. And if you want to email me, amos@moogmusic.com, and explain that a little bit further, I would love to talk with you about it and see if that's a thing we can do, because that sounds super cool. What you can do right now is, and this was added I think in the last update, but I don't know if we talked about it. If you go to the Sequencer More page for any of the sequences, 1, 2, or 3, you have an output selection, and that says output the notes from this sequence only to synth 1, or only to the synth that it lives within, or you can choose to output to all synths. Now, rather than chaining things together for complexity and greater than 64 steps, what that does is it allows the sequencer to behave like the local keyboard for the case where you have a stacked or layered or split sound, where you've got maybe more than one synth is responding to a given key, or you want a sequence that goes across a range where part of those notes are on one synth and part are on another. It means you can do all of that from within one sequence just the way you can do it from the main keyboard and output that sequence to all of the synths. So in case that wasn't highlighted when that feature was introduced, I'm mentioning it now because it's relevant. It's a useful trick to be able to have one sequence controlling multiple synths. But as far as chaining them together in some nonlinear, longer fashion, right now that is not an option. Next question, if you have a tempo that varies in your DAW, I noticed the sync tempo on the one doesn't move instantly. Is that expected? Yes, that is expected, and the reason for that is because all MIDI clocks jitter. That is basically a true statement. There are a few very expensive, purpose-built, super outboard MIDI clocks that have, you know, no jitter or almost no jitter, but by and large, especially if you're just hooking up a USB cable from your computer to the synth and sending MIDI clock, the timing is going to be interrupted by background tasks that your computer is doing. USB does not have real-time priority, so you know, if there's something CPU hogging going on in the background, you might get worse MIDI timing, and that can result in sonic artifacts like wobbly delay times or jittery notes or stuff that you really don't want. And so what we do is we apply a little bit of filtering to tempo changes that come into the Moog One, so it takes it just a little bit of time to ramp up to the new tempo. Usually that's not a problem. Most pieces of music tend to stay at the same tempo. Most tempo changes tend not to be super all over the place, and it definitely addresses the jitter issue. If your music involves wild tempo changes, you know, that are large and come quickly one after the other, you may notice the Moog One, you know, ramping up to that tempo over a little bit of time. If that is musically a problem for you, let me know. We may be able to adjust that. We may be able to, maybe it even becomes a user setting where someone who has specifically intense tempo change requirements could have a more responsive system that was, you know, maybe it was subject to a little bit more jitter, which might not be a problem in your system. This is the sort, you know, we may need to dial this in for individual use cases. Where it is right now is pretty good for the vast majority of people's use cases, and primarily gives you a good, clean sounding, jitter-free response under ordinary external clock circumstances. But yes, there is a little bit of a ramp up to tempo changes, which you'll hear if you do big tempo changes quickly. Okay, let's see if there's anything else I haven't mentioned. Oh yeah, so coming attractions. As I said, we made a big improvement to MIDI sync, MIDI start-stop, song position pointer. A lot of folks are still wondering when full MIDI implementation of, you know, MIDI CCs, NRPNs for all of the knobs, all the other fun MIDI features that this instrument is, you know, was designed to have and is specified to have. All of that is actively in development right now. One of my colleagues is busy working at this very moment to He's working right now on the MIDI controller piece. And essentially we are, there is going to be more MIDI in the next update, and we're going to keep at it until the full MIDI implementation is rolled out as quickly as we're able to develop and test those features. So there's more MIDI in this update, there will be more MIDI in the next update, and very soon it'll all be in there. And another question, when the ARP is on and you trigger it from an external keyboard or sequencer, the chord sounds as well as the ARP starting. Yes, that is a known issue. That was certainly a known issue prior to 1.0.4 because the way that external MIDI was assigned to channels, the arpeggiator and sequencer weren't on the same page with the basic synth engine when that was happening. I believe that to be fixed now, but I will go check right after we're finished here, and if that's still an issue, I can tell you, yes, it will definitely be fixed, or if this is a question based on performance in 1.0.3, it's possible you may find that that specific use case is already fixed. Certainly it was the case previously that the arpeggiator wasn't responding on the same channel as the synth had been set to. That is definitely fixed. Arpeggiator, sequencer, and just plain old synth MIDI notes, they all follow the per channel specification that you can set up in the synth now. So that's another improvement. I guess I can go through the bug fixes. That kind of counts as a bug fix. I have my release notes here. You can follow along at home if you like. The screensaver is working again. That's a really minor thing, but if you leave the synth running for 30 minutes or more, the little OLED screens in the oscillator section now turn off and show a little test pattern so they don't burn in. That's back. As I just mentioned, MIDI channel filtering for the arpeggiator and sequencer now follows the synth per synth. More questions are coming in. I'll get back to the bug fixes in a minute. Next question is, will there ever be audio over USB? Well, no is a safe answer. There could always be surprise good news later. I believe there is no plan at this time to implement audio over USB. And I'll leave it there and not speculate further because we try not to speculate too wildly around here, even as we constantly work in the background to do amazing and surprising new things. So you never know, but no. Moving along. Okay, so anything else good? Oh yeah, small but useful bug fix related to the sequencer. If you have it in note trig mode, and so you're playing a sequence, you can hear there that it was stopping the sequence when I stopped playing the note and resuming on the next note of the sequence when I play a note again. Previously there was a small bug where it would repeat the last note it had played and then start playing new notes, and that's musically not super useful. So that is fixed, and now note trig works the way it should and is super nice. Let's see. Oh yeah, another small but irritating bug that is fixed is that the step mod button in the sequencer, if you turn on step mod, it basically captures all of your knob moves for any parameter that can be a sequenced modulation. Instead of directly affecting the synth, it writes that knob tweak to the sequencer automation page. And the problem was that it was also capturing some knobs that it couldn't actually use, which meant that they just didn't do anything useful. Like, for example, the sequencer on-off button was not working when you were in step mod mode, even though you can't actually sequence whether the sequencer is on or not, which logically makes sense. And also the master volume knob was being captured and not working when step mod was on. Those controls both work normally now, whether step mod is on or off. I think those are the those are the headlines for this update. As I said, even before this was packaged and ready for release, we were already, several of our team members were working on, features for the next update. We have an ambitious schedule to, get a lot more implemented as quickly and as well as we can. And let's see, I guess I can open the floor to further questions at this time. I can noodle around. I'm at your service, and I don't actually know how long this has gone on or how long we're going to keep going. I could even wrap things up. I feel like I'm overlooking something, but like I might need someone to prompt me to speak to a particular subject before I can do that. So I'm at your service. I think I know what's going on here. Step mod, that's right. Oh yes, someone would like to know if aftertouch sensitivity can be adjusted. That's actually, this came up in a conversation earlier today. See, I just needed prompting. Right now, there is not a built-in adjustment for aftertouch sensitivity. Yes, absolutely, it can be and it will be. There are a couple of things that, well, again, I don't want to talk too much about the nitty-gritty details of what isn't implemented yet because it's better to talk about it when it's done. But the short answer is we fully intend to allow aftertouch to be adjusted. I would say right now, one way that you can adjust the strength of aftertouch, and this may be old news to the person who's asking, but if you create a modulation using aftertouch, so I'm going to do that right now. Hold AT, adjust the filter cutoff. So that has a certain sensitivity to it, essentially. And I can control that to a certain extent by just going into the mod matrix page. And there are a couple of things that can be done. You can simply adjust the amount so that the maximum is less. But if you want the curve of it to be a little bit different, you can use a squared or cubed transform. And I can't convey how the feel of the aftertouch changes just by playing it for you, because it's going to sound about the same. But in fact, those adjustments do change the curve of the response a little bit, and that's what you can do now. I do plan to have a more elaborate facility for adjusting the feel of aftertouch, a way to go in and dial that in for your personal taste. Let's see. I mean, there's so much more that we're actively working on right now. It is like physically uncomfortable to not talk about stuff that we're currently working on that isn't out yet. But one of the reasons that we try not to do that is not that we don't want to be transparent. We absolutely do want to make sure that the community out there knows what we're working on and knows where we're going with these things. But we don't want to spread misinformation or confusion. There's a lot of, in the course of development, we try a bunch of things and we refine our approach and we figure out what works. So if I was to tease something that we haven't tried yet, and then we try it and it doesn't work and we got to do something different, that can cause bad feelings, that can cause confusion. The goal is to be fully transparent while also keeping the messaging clear about what we're doing and what's in, what's out. So that's why I'm limited in talking about things that are still in the R&D process. As soon as we're confident, we know it works, this is the approach, and we can explain it clearly, and we're not going to have to double back and correct ourselves, then we'll share all that information as soon as we can, as soon as it's clear. And that's how we try to keep it. Oh boy, more questions. Eagerly awaiting the last few words of this question to trickle in, and then I shall answer it. And here it is. Can I address changes in the poly count and unison modes? Some of us had problems with available voices not triggering notes or envelopes correctly. Yes, that is, again, that's an area where we are still doing work, and we have made a lot of improvements there to the way that the instrument responds to changing voice counts, excuse me, the poly count and the max count. The way available voices is intended to work is that if you have, 2 or 3 synths, you can set some of them to a specific number of voices, like 2 or 4 or 6. And if you have, you can set one of the synths to use available voices, which means all the voices that aren't specifically reserved for these other synths. Now, if you have more than one synth set to use available voices, that was a scenario where it didn't always work correctly, and you could end up with a situation where you seemed to be out of voices even though you knew that you were only holding down fewer keys than you had hardware voices to play. And that should be better now, and certainly one thing that you can do if you're having that issue is go into the Polyphony More page and adjust the poly count for one or another of the synth layers, and that should sort it out if it's in a state that it shouldn't be in. But again, that's another one. Stealing modes are something that I believe still needs work, and they're on our to-do list. And as we go in there, we will look at unison count and poly count. There was some feedback just today, I think, from someone that was talking about the situation where they have a unison count that's less than all their available voices, like 4. And if you've got a unison count of 4 and a poly count of 4, does that mean that I should be able to play four voice unison notes at the same time on my 16-voice instrument? Yes, you should be able to do that. If anything seems weird or off about that, then that's something that is very important to us to look at, get in touch directly, or if this is a follow-up to a question where you have already gotten in touch with us directly, we're looking at that, and we'll make sure that anything that's not optimal about that now is fixed. But again, it's worth checking out your scenario that you're interested in 1.0.4 and see if any of the improvements that we've made address your issue. And if not, then of course, we'll fix it and let us know. Okay, and next question, is the OS based on Juice, C++, and some other letters that I can't read? Yes, there is C++ in here. There is Juice in here. There's C++ in the Juice and outside of it. Basically, this is a mixed system that has, Juice is running essentially the main UI, the GUI, and how it handles the front panel controls, etc. This is a network of 8 or 16 individual voices. Pairs of voices have their own control processors. There's a master voice controller that controls whether MIDI notes are sent to this group of voices for this synth or that one. So it's a complex system with a lot of processors talking to each other. Some of that code is written in C, some is written in C++, some is written in Scheme. We tried to use the right tools for the job to the best of our ability in different layers of a layered system. So there's a lot going on in there. Juice is a part of it, and there are other parts as well. I would say C++ is the majority, the language that is used most in this instrument. Next question, is there any possibility to octave transpose each individual synth? Absolutely there is. There are multiple places that you can do octave transpose. The main one that I think would be useful for what you're talking about is, last time I checked, that was on the left-hand controller more page. And if you scroll down to the bottom, you'll see semitone transpose, and that is per synth. So let's see here. This should be okay, just a moment. That's 2 different synth layers. And I have transposed them off by, a fifth. I can change that to an octave. And so yeah, the short answer is yes. If you go to the left-hand controller more page, you can transpose an individual synth up or down by an octave from the semitone transpose menu there. And so that's independent of, your oscillators have their own octaves, everything is set up the way it's set up. This is a master transpose for the whole thing, up or down, relative to the standard tuning of the keyboard. So that should get you what you're asking for. All right, next question is coming in here. Hey, idea, maybe we could set up like a little LED ticker that just streams the questions as they come in. That would be slick. But we're not quite there yet. So, will we see any more specific stereo spread per voice? For example, panning all voices full left and right respectively. All voices left and right respectively. Well, I mean, you can certainly do that per synth, stereo spread per voice. Okay, just to be clear, a voice in Moog 1 land, a voice is a monosynth, pretty much. It is, all of your oscillators going into your filters, going to your output. That is a mono thing, and you've got a pan position for that mono thing. So an individual voice has a pan position. A single individual voice isn't in stereo, it has a position in a stereo field. So if you're playing multiple voices, you can pan them out relative to each other. If you're playing a single voice, you can park it somewhere in the stereo field like you can with any other mono signal. With the slight exception, caveat, if you're running it into stereo effects, the output of that effect is stereo, but per each individual voice, it's a mono sound source, like a guitar is a mono sound source or a trumpet is a mono sound source. And you can put it somewhere in space. As far as more options for how that's going to work, we have added a mid-side processing that lets you super stereoize the whole master effects mix. There is per voice panning. There's auto panning. So you've got your fixed pan position, and then you've got on your VCA More page, you've got spread. And spread, as you play notes, each successive note goes to a different place in the stereo field, and you can make that wider or narrower. I think that's it. I think that's all the ideas we've had for panning for now. But if you have specific new ideas for panning that are compatible with the hardware, hit us up. We can do new things. And the next question is, will there be user calibration capabilities for tuning of oscillators or filters? That is something that we've talked about a lot, and it's a little bit involved. The reason it's not there yet is due to the size of the project, but there's a UI designed for it already. We've done a lot of work towards having user calibration, and so I would say it is likelier than not that you will see that in a future update, timing TBD. If I had to, I'm not supposed to speculate, but if I had to speculate, I would say that we will get the tuning from the factory as excellent as we can get it, and we'll finish out the round of improvements that we're currently working on for tuning, and then we'll look at making that user-facing. That's sort of along the lines of the discussions that we've had, but it's on our minds. We've designed a user-facing tuning UI, and we'll implement that in due course of time. And I think that's about all the time we have for today. I appreciate your patience nerding out with me here. If you have further questions, hit us up, talk to Moog Service, send us emails, come by the Moog shop. We're here to help, and we're always glad to speak with our users. So thank you very much, and I appreciate your time.